Welcome to Lecture 5. We're now out of the digestive system chapter, Chapter 17, and we're going to jump into Chapter 20, which is urinary system. So you should have in front of you now your lecture outline key for Chapter 20. Starting then with section 20.2 in your textbook, let's go ahead and again from the lecture outline, let's talk about the function of the kidneys. And notice then 7 major functions are listed here. First of all, the kidneys regulate the volume of body fluids. Number 2, they also regulate the composition of body fluids, what's in the body fluids. Number 3, regulate the pH of body fluids. This one goes along with number 2 above, but it's important enough that it's being listed separately. Fourth, then, excreting metabolic wastes. Number 5, helping to control red blood cell production. And recall then from Chapter 13, and also from A&P 1, and you might just want to jot down here, that the kidneys produce a hormone called EPO, all in caps. And if you just jot down EPO, I won't ask you at this point to come up with the name of the hormone. You may recall EPO is short for erythropoietin. But again then, as we've talked about already in Chapter 13, erythropoietin is that hormone that helps control red blood cell production. Number 6 then, the kidneys help regulate blood pressure. And the 7th function of the kidneys, the 7th major function of the kidneys, they help regulate the absorption of calcium ions. So kidney structure, and let's take a look now on page 773 at figure 20.4 at the top of the page. And we don't need to go through all of this again in any amount of detail. So just take a glance and you should be able to go, okay, yeah, I'm really familiar by now, hopefully, with the structure of the kidney. So we'll jump down to the next topic then, which is renal blood vessels. And here, I'd like you to flip over to page 775 and take a look at figure 20.8. And you'll notice what we're seeing here is the pathway of blood as it comes into the kidneys, moves through the kidneys, and finally leaves the kidneys. So I would like you to know this pathway and to be able to list this pathway or portions of this pathway if they were asked on a quiz or on an exam. But for the moment, what I'd like you to do is not worry too much about all of this listing, and let's just go ahead and follow through using figures in your textbook this blood flow. You may recall also blood flow through the kidneys was gone over in the kidney model video. Let's start then with figure 20.5 on page 773. And I'd like you, first of all, labeled up at the top right of those 2 blood vessels being shown, just find the abdominal aorta. Blood flow then is from the abdominal aorta to the renal artery. And notice this is oxygenated blood that we're seeing here. From here, let's flip over to page 774. And I'd like you to locate now, starting down in the lower left portion of the right-hand figure, go ahead and locate that artery that's making its way up between 2 renal pyramids. And you'll notice then that this artery is an interlobar artery, so making its way up between the lobe-like structures that are the renal pyramids. If you follow that interlobar artery along, notice it then gives rise to branches, each of which is called an arcuate artery. And again, here we're focusing on the arteries, So we're focusing on the red blood vessels. Notice that in many cases there's a corresponding vein, which we'll talk about in just a couple of minutes. But again, find that arcuate artery, and the term arcuate then, so it kind of follows the arch or the arc of the top of the renal pyramid. If you follow now that arcuate artery along, notice in turn that an arcuate artery gives rise to cortical radiate arteries. So take a minute, find the cortical radiate artery that's being labeled for you on the diagram. And the term then, cortical radiate arteries, so they radiate, they make their way up into the renal cortex. From here, let's flip over to page 776 and figure 20.9, top left figure. And these cortical radiate arteries that we were just talking about then, in turn, empty into, give rise to vessels called afferent arterioles. So take a minute now, and again, upper left on page 776, notice that afferent arteriole again. Realize that it's branching off of a cortical radiate artery. And notice blood flows then from an afferent arteriole into the glomerulus, into that capillary bed that you should be very familiar with by now from having learned about the structure of the kidney. And then after the blood makes its way through this capillary system, as the individual blood cells take a pathway and eventually make their way through the glomerulus, the blood then leaves the glomerulus through an afferent arteriole. And again, on page 776 then, go ahead and locate that afferent arteriole. From here, let's go to page 777 and figure 20.10. And let's take a look now down at the bottom part of that figure, so 2010b. Take a minute, upper left-hand portion, locate that afferent arteriole that we were just talking about, and notice then that each afferent arteriole leads into a peritubular capillary. Let's go back now to page 774, figure 20.6. Locate now in the upper left-hand part of that figure a peritubular capillary. And from here, once the blood has passed through a peritubular capillary system, the blood is now deoxygenated and the blood is basically on its way out of the kidney. And so again, back to figure 20.6 then, trace the flow of blood from a peritubular capillary, and notice it will flow into a cortical radiate vein right next to a cortical radiate artery, but now carrying the blood in the other direction. If you trace this blood flow from a cortical radiate vein, you'll notice that each of these veins empties into an arcuate vein, and again right next to an arcuate artery, again following the arc, following the arched area just above a renal pyramid. From here, if you trace that blood through the arcuate vein, notice arcuate veins empty into interlobar veins, and trace that interlobar vein all the way back down now between the two renal pyramids. From here, let's go back to page 773. And figure 20.5. And blood flow now then is from one of those interlobar veins we just talked about into a renal vein, and renal veins in turn empty into the inferior vena cava. Let's make this the end of lecture 5, and we'll come back in lecture 6 and talk about nephrons.